So thanks to everyone for attending this first webinar of the UK Centre of Excellence in In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation that we are delivering together with a group of colleagues from industry and in general other organizations across the globe. And it is my pleasure today to introduce this first webinar that is entitled Contemporary Landscape on Computational Modeling and Simulation in Support of Regulatory Applications. And that will be introduced by Jeff Bischoff, Mark Horner, Mark Palmer, and Brandon Lurie. Before we get into that, just a couple of brief words about the UK CEiRSI. So this is a center which is a national national capability in the UK that is coordinated by the Christopher Pancras Institute at the University of Manchester in collaboration with the University of Manchester Innovation Unit. And it brings together some of the UK's brightest minds and international minds from across academia, industry, and regulatory affairs to make medical product testing and approval processes faster, safer, and more cost-effective. This is funding for the next 12 months that will start with a phase that we kick off today, effectively, of a number of webinars. All of them will be recorded, and you could watch them subsequently. There is going to be information share after this meeting, and we will most likely attach to that video a number of additional resources that you might be interested in following up. So with that, and without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Jeff Bischoff from Zimmer Biomet that will take it over from here. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Good morning. Good afternoon to everyone. If someone can give me a thumbs up that you can see the slide correctly and you're hearing me okay? Coming through? Okay, perfect. So my pleasure to be here this morning and kick off this webinar. My name is Jeff Bischoff, as Alex mentioned. I'm from Zimmer Biomet, so I have 3 affiliations here on the slide here, all of which are relevant. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit. So my day job over the past almost 2 decades now, I've been with Zimmer and now Zimmer Biomet, which is a large med tech company focused in orthopedic solutions. And during that time, I've been doing biomechanical simulation from the get-go. So I come into this webinar as someone who's been not just thinking about this, but putting simulation into practice in support of medical devices for many years across the globe. The second affiliation that I show here is almost for as long as I've been with Zimmer Biomet. I've been associated with the ASME VNV40 subcommittee. That subcommittee was formed about 15 years ago. I've been a part of it almost since inception, and over about the past 5 years, I've been the chair since basically since publication of the 2018 standard through today. So that's going to come out also in my materials today. And finally, why are we here? I'm a fan of the CEiRSI here. I'm a big fan of and rooter for everything that Alex and team are doing. I'm an advocate for what the CEiRSI is all about. So very happy to do my part to try and continue momentum in the UK in this general space. So as a little bit of an orientation to the webinar today, as Alex mentioned, we have 4 different speakers. I will talk a little bit more about them as we get further into it. Myself, Mark Horner from ANSYS, Mark Palmer from ANSYS, and Brandon Lurie from Gore. So a nice varied audience, varied voices, varied opinions, but hopefully the narrative that comes out at the end is pretty consistent from the different perspectives that we bring to bear. So before getting into it, just a little bit of an orientation again to me. So I mentioned Zimmer Biomet is a company that's focused primarily on musculoskeletal health. If we had thought about what that means 10, 20, 30 years ago, right, I think everyone would have focused on that central image of we have a joint replacement, and what we are doing as a device manufacturer is coming up with the best possible joint replacements or other devices. Over the past handful of years, I think the collective intelligence around medtech generally has gone beyond just the devices, right? It's about the full healthcare experience for the patient, from the initial diagnosis of the disease all the way to presumably forgetting about you had any intervention whatsoever. And I bring this up because throughout this whole spectrum now, not just focused on the device, but all the other aspects of diagnosing, planning, execution, post-operative monitoring, there are opportunities for modeling and simulation in ways that we would not have anticipated, I think, a decade or 2 or 3 ago. That's why I bring this up. And we should think about why, right? Why are we interested in modeling and simulation within devices? Why are we interested in having this discussion as part of this webinar? Why are we interested in this CEiRSI? Why? And so I want to give a little bit of my own perspective, and then we're going to get quickly into the content. So my own perspective as being, again, in the orthopedic space now for a couple of decades, this here is a very typical example of what we try and do within the device space, right? We have a design A. You could consider that one to be the blue stem. So this is an image of a shoulder, the humerus in the shoulder. Within a total shoulder replacement, you have a piece that goes into the humeral bone, the humeral stem. And we have two different stems, right? We have a stem that potentially has been on the market for a while, and we have a new stem that we're trying to introduce across the whole globe, right? And for those in the device industry, we very typically take a look at worst case scenarios when we're doing these sorts of evaluations. We try and take a look at the anatomical considerations. We take a look at the design considerations. We take a look at the biomechanical, in vivo loading conditions to try and come up with, okay, what's the worst thing? What's the worst environment for this system? What's the worst environment for this existing system? And let's make sure that that comparison works out favorably. That has worked for many years in the device industry. I think we can do better nowadays. I think we ought to do better nowadays. As an example of this, this is now one of the complexities of a typical contemporary device from my perspective, right? So we have two systems, right? The medium and the short system, as they're called here, the blue and the red system, right? Each of these systems we're trying to design for a global population. So we have a wide range of different diameters. And so the x-axis here of this distribution is you have very, very small diameter stems, so 4 millimeter diameter, right? That's a pretty tiny stem, all the way up to 20 millimeter diameter stems, right? And within the solutions that we're trying to provide to patients, right, we want to canvas this whole space while knowing that based on anatomical variability around the world, we're not going to have many patients at the tail ends of the distribution, right? This is an anatomical story, but it applies for many other variables that are essentially non-controllable within the device space. And we now think about gathering clinical evidence, right, for all of these different variations of this system, right? So different lengths, different diameters, different compatibilities. There's always going to be these peripheral configurations that are very, very important for the clinical community, but which we are really going to be struggling to gather adequate clinical evidence for because of those low numbers. And as we see regulations continue to evolve, right, we know that the regulations are continuing to push us to gather clinical evidence exactly for those lower volume variants. That is a real challenge that we're facing in today's device space. So how can we do this, right? This comes back to the why that I was getting to. How can we address this? Well, we want to do this with computational modeling, right? So this workflow here that I've laid out is a very typical one that many people across the large device space are doing. Image-based analysis. You start out with a patient image. It could be CT, it could be MRI, it could be something else depending on what is the system, what is the physics that you're chasing after, right? You have some amount of image data, personalized image data. You end up taking that and putting it into a virtual representation. You do your virtual implantation, virtual evaluation of the device, and you come up with a result, right? So that now becomes a patient-specific simulation. And now we build not just one patient-specific model, we now build that based on input data from a clinical cohort, right? And with that, we can start to get, right, I think an unprecedented amount of insights into how these devices are actually going to perform across a full clinical population. We will have access to data, to predictions, to evidence, to build out those peripheries where we struggle to have adequate clinical evidence. And also, we have insights that we cannot get just from other types of evidence, including clinical evidence, right? From clinical work, from clinical studies, we have ideas about patient outcomes, we have ideas about revisions, we have ideas about causes for revision very coarsely. But with modeling and simulation, we have the real capability to look inside of those course metrics to really understand what is going on. And with these types of population-based frameworks, really tease out, right, what are the combinations of patient or device or surgical or other variables that contribute to what in most cases are relatively small numbers of revisions nowadays. If we want to address those revisions, if we want to come out with better outcomes at those peripherals, I think we really need simulation tools like this. So the big why, right? Why are we continuing to lead this train of CM&S into the device industry? From my perspective, it's to unwrap the availability of applications like this to build more evidence in areas where we really need it to improve outcomes. Now, a month or two ago, I was asked to give a talk on why should regulators trust us. This was within a technical meeting in orthopedics. It was within a larger session about building confidence in computational modeling and simulation. My specific angle was, why should regulators trust us? And I was thinking about this in preparing for this seminar here. A month ago, there were no regulators in the audience. Today, I think there are regulators in the audience. So I want to reframe the question here a little bit from why should regulators trust us to why should patients, clinicians, right, our end users trust us. And the us now is not just me as a medical device developer, right, but us as the entire system that is contributing to getting what should be good devices out and accessible to patients and clinicians. Why should patients and clinicians trust us? If we take a look at other industries, right now, maybe aerospace is not really a great example nowadays, but I think the general impression that many of us have is that modeling and simulation within the aerospace industry is very well developed. It's being used for many good ends. If we take a look at the automotive industry, if we take a look at the nuclear industry, right, many of these more established industries, I think generally from within the med tech space, within the modeling side of med tech space, we look at these other industries and hold them out as being much more advanced, much more accepted within the regulatory environment, much more successful and incorporated it more deeply into the design and development process. Whereas if we look at our space, we are dudes in basements doing simulation. And this is a phrase that I did not create myself. This is a phrase that I'm taking from a regulator about 10 or 12 years ago in the early stages of the VNV40 effort, when the regulator was lamenting, right, how do we trust simulation results coming from industry when, for all we know, right, you folks in industry, you are dudes in basement doing simulation. That was the view of the space at the time by this one person. So given this perspective, now that perspective has changed a little bit over the past couple of years. The question still remains, though, why should modeling and simulation be trusted? And my answer to that, which is going to be the focus of this webinar here today, is we should be trusted because of the process. Now, this reference here, you may notice from my accent that I'm American. This is an American reference. We have sports in America, as you have in the UK. And there's a very interesting story. It's a story from the development of a major sports team within the US, where they were trying to build a better team basically out of nothing. And the message was, as the leaders of this team were doing this, prepare for a couple years of struggle, right, as we build up the team, But once we get past those couple years of struggle, then we will really have something that you as fans are supportive of. Trust the process, right? And why I bring this up here is because I think in looking at the state of computational modeling and simulation 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we have been steadily building the process within the medtech space. And it's because of that effort over the past decade, 2 decades, that have put us in the position now where we can really not just continue doing CM&S for the basic applications that we've been doing for years, but also look at some of these emerging areas of in silico clinical trials, of patient-specific modeling, all these other things that we see the potential for. How can we do this? Because we have built the process. And that's what I want to talk about primarily today. What is that process as we have it right now? So the process, the contemporary landscape. So again, these are the 4 speakers to give a bit of an overview of what you can expect over the next hour and a half or so. I'm going to talk about a couple different things. There have been a couple documents that have come out of the United States Food and Drug Administration over the past couple years. I want to speak about those. A couple months ago, we would have had folks in the FDA speaking about these directly. As you all know, we don't necessarily have that liberty right now. So I'm going to do the best that I can to represent those as essentially a user of those guidances. And we also will provide some links to more detailed discussions of those by the FDA personnel that you can access later on. I'm going to talk about those 2. I'm going to talk about ASME VNV40, which was published in 2018, which established a credibility framework around how we can generally use modeling and simulation to support device development. Mark Horner is then going to come in and he's going to give some perspectives on some other areas where we're developing standards around manufacturing within pharmaceuticals, around the use of AI and ML within potentially device submissions, and also the concept of good simulation practices. So look for Mark Horner to give some insights there. Mark Palmer is then going to jump in. He's going to talk about some efforts from the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which has worked closely with the FDA in recent years, with industry, with other advocates in the space to come up with their view of modeling and simulation in the contemporary medtech space. Brandon Lurie from Gore will talk about an end-to-end example. So a lot of, I think what the first 3 talks are going to give are some guidances, some processes, some documents, things like this. Brandon's going to get a little bit more into details of, okay, this is great. How is this actually impacting work that simulation analysts are doing that regulators are seeing right now? And then once that's done, I will come back in for a few minutes at the end to talk about a little bit of a kernel of things to come with VNV40, and then we can open it up to questions as their interest. We have 2 hours allocated to this. Now that we're into it, we'll see how far it goes. We definitely won't go over 2 hours, but we can engage as long as it seems sensible that we can keep on going with this. Okay, so the process. Let me get into it. The first of the 3 bits that I want to talk about within the process, right? The key things that have really changed that have defined the current landscape, I would say, within CM&S. The first one is this guidance that came from the FDA almost a decade ago now. And this document is not around how to do simulation. It isn't about how to validate simulation. It's really tell me what you've done, right? So a very basic perspective when we are dealing with simulation, right? We've done some stuff. How do we document it fully so that others within the decision-making process can understand what's been done and make decisions on whether it is legitimate? This is the guidance that came out in 2016. And this guidance laid out all these different bits and pieces of documentation that you would expect to see within a report, within a design history file for a device nowadays, if you're using simulation. Many of these are very sensible. We talk about, a background to the problem. We talk about code verification. Does the code work? We talk about describing the computational model, whether it's a structural mechanics model, whether it's a CFD application, whether it's something else. You go through and you talk about the device geometry. You talk about the boundary conditions. Tell me what you are doing, right? Orient me to the problem. Section 10 is about validation. I'm going to come back a little bit to this one later. And then results and discussion. as you would expect in any peer-reviewed literature, a discussion around the limitations and conclusions, right? So a very nice thing. This doesn't say how to do necessarily any of these. It just says from the perspective of a regulator, when you send to me a document that you think is providing reasonable evidence in support of the device and it's using simulation, tell the story in this way. Don't forget about any of these chapters. Not groundbreaking, shouldn't have been groundbreaking, but let's take a look. More recently, and so remember, this was published in 2016. So around 4 years later, the FDA, a number of investigators from the FDA, assessed this. So they weren't spanning the peer-reviewed literature, where we know that sometimes things like verification and validation aren't really talked about too much. This isn't spanning conference proceedings that we all go to. We all see interesting work where maybe there's a little bit less attention on verification, validation, uncertainty quantification, right? It's more on what are the sensational aspects of the model. These were taken from submissions reviewed by the agency specifically in support of devices over a span of time. And they were looking to see what bits of information were in those submissions that were intended to convince, right, a regulator that good work has been done, the results are credible, and we have a reasonable device. So what did this show? So this is the take-home figure for me anyway from that paper. And it shows that along a number of the different elements that guidance document, which keep in mind was published 4 years prior to this study being published, you know, the basic stuff of background. Okay, when we write technical reports, we talk about background. That's not a surprise. We talk about system geometry, right? This is the device that we're looking at. This is the size. This is the shape. No big deal. We talk about boundary conditions, right? We're loading it in a certain way. This is the flow, you know, whatever the case might be. We talk about those sorts of things. And certainly we talk about results, right? We very rarely, right, publish a report that doesn't have results. Those were all very high marks. But then you start to get down and you see that there are very basic elements of defining a simulation that are lacking. Material properties, 20% of these reports, right? These regulatory grade reports lacked information on material properties. What constitutive law was used? What was the numerical solver? What are the characteristics of your mesh, right? If you're doing FEA or you're doing CFD, this isn't even talking about whether you've done a mesh convergence study. It's talking about, was the mesh even described, right? When we talk about verification, that's even less. That's on the order of 10%, right? 10% of submissions not too long ago addressed convergence study. Almost none of them talked about the legitimacy of the code. Less than half gave any mention whatsoever of validation. So the point is, this document here that was published that says these are the things you ought to do, we generally weren't doing it. We were lacking, right? So now step one in the process, this is part of the process. If you're doing good work, write what you've done in this way so that we can close some of these gaps within the sorts of documents that regulators are seeing in current submissions. Okay, step two. This now leads to the V&V 40 document. So ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, spent about 10 years developing this. This was published in 2018. The previous document from the FDA talked about these are the things you document, right? It didn't say, how do you do verification and validation? It didn't say how much verification and validation is appropriate, right? That was still completely subject to the individual trainings, experiences, things like this of the individuals who are doing the work. The purpose of this document was to provide more of a process around what are appropriate levels of verification and validation in order to support evaluations of devices, recognizing that decisions we make on devices are pretty darn important, right? We can make good decisions, we can make bad decisions, and those impact patients, right? And so the essence of V&V 40, as I like to tell it, are these 3 points. The first one is the idea of context of use. whenever we do simulation, we kind of know what we're doing. Well, I'm gonna study this, right? I'm gonna simulate this, and I want to see what the stress state is. I want to see what the flow properties are, right? These are very vague statements of how we use simulation. In many scenarios, those vague statements work. A key part of VNV40 was, let's do better on that. Let's really make sure we understand what is the context of use for the simulation that we are doing in support of the device, right? What exactly is the metric that we're pulling out? What is that metric going to be used for? What decision are we making on the device that is based on that metric? What other types of evidence come in to inform that decision in addition to simulation, right? All of these are sort of built into this idea of context of use. Think about that more carefully. Think about what it is exactly that you want to do and how you're going to use the results. If you've done this, then you can come up with essentially a risk profile for this simulation, recognizing that across the full spectrum of medical devices, right, we're talking about life-sustaining, life-enabling, quality of life, right? A wide range of devices. We're talking about context of use where modeling and simulation is very central to the decision being made versus a relatively minor contributor to the decision, right? These all contribute into higher or lower risk profiles for the context of use. And then the third part is based on that model risk, right? That then drives more or less activities to demonstrate the credibility, with the idea that credibility, model credibility, right, the trust that we have in the model, we gain that by doing more, better verification, more, better validation, those sorts of activities. The more we do those activities, the more we're successful with those, we enhance the credibility of the model, and we can support applications for higher risk simulations. So the idea of model risk, if I want to lean a little bit more into this. There are two contributors to model risk. One is model influence. And the way that VNV40 frames model influence is, again, we have different types of evidence that we use to support decisions on devices. From my side, right, if I'm taking a look at a shoulder stem, like I showed in that initial slide, right, one of the failure modes that we would be interested in is it going to fracture, right? And so when we think about, is it going to fracture? Well, we can use simulation to support that. We could use physical testing, benchtop testing to support that. We could look at clinical evidence of comparable devices to demonstrate, is that failure mode clinically relevant, right? There are a number of bits of information that we can use to sufficiently manage the risk associated with that failure mode. Model influence reflects the extent to which we are leaning on results from the simulation relative to these other types of evidence, with the reasonable idea that the more we're leaning on the results of the simulation, right, the higher the risk we're going to have associated with the application. Contrast that with the vertical axis here, which is now decision consequence. And as I mentioned, within the broader medical device landscape, I live in one, relatively narrow space of orthopedic devices. We have folks who are doing cardiovascular devices. We have all sorts of different things that impact patients in different ways. And so decision consequence has to do with, right, if we're making a decision on the strength of a humeral shoulder stem, for example, versus the strength of an instrument that is being used to support a surgery versus the strength of a device that is life-sustaining, right? All of these, if we're wrong on an assessment of the strength, the impact on the patient varies quite a bit, right? And the more the impact on the patient, or also the more the impact on other factors, then the higher risk is associated with that simulation. So that's the central concept of model risk within VNV40. And the other key attribute was, okay, we have more risk. Now we want to establish more credibility in the model. How do we do this? Well, this is now the process you follow, right? It's not left to me to try and figure this out. In fact, what VNV40 lays out is there are specific activities around verification that you should think about and do. And beyond that, there are aspects of verification with the code, right? Does the software itself work? Was the software developed following good contemporary software development processes? Many of us in practice will use commercial tools. That's great. Did the commercial vendor, right, do their job? Do we know that they did their job well? Also, for a lot of these emerging applications, we as device manufacturers, we're also developing code, right? We're developing scripts, we're developing APIs. So are we following best practices for doing that? Have we tested that the software is working as intended? So there's this area of code verification, which if you think back to the FDA study, isn't done very much at all, right? At least at that point 5 years ago within that space of devices. So that's the idea of code verification. Calculation verification, right? Do a basic convergence study. All of us who are trained contemporarily on mechanistic-based simulations, right? We know the idea of a convergence study, right? So let's do this. This is a way to generate credibility, but it's not the only way. We also have use error that can come in. So as an analyst, I'm in the computer, I'm doing this. Maybe I type in the wrong number, right? How do I make sure that I have not made those sorts of silly mistakes? So these are different aspects of calculation verification. And then we get to the validation side of things. Verification, validation. And so validation is, okay, we have some predictions from the model. What is a referent data set that we deem to be credible? Typically it would be a benchtop test. It could be other types of data, right? What is this other evidence that we can compare the results from our simulation against to instill confidence that the model is appropriately validated? And what VNV40 does is it doesn't just say, okay, do this validation, right? It says these are specific things to think about when planning, when executing, when documenting your validation study. Within your computational model, right? How much within the model have you explored the sensitivity of the results to some of the model assumptions you've made, to some of the input parameters in the simulation, right? Basically, virtually palpating the model to figure out sensitivity. You don't want to be right for the wrong reasons, right? So the model, the aspects of the validation on a computational model give more confidence that if you are right, you're right for the right reasons. The second one is comparator. And so comparators is somewhat of a new word. Essentially, it means when we wrote this VV40, it's the benchtop test, right? So you have this baseline test, you've tested some number of samples, you've maybe done test method validation, you've looked at these different things. So lean into that and tell me about your benchtop test looking at these different factors. It doesn't just have to be a benchtop test. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more when we talk about revision to VNV40, but certainly much of how VNV40 is currently written frames the comparator around a typical benchtop test. And then we have the assessment, right? So we've done the modeling work, we've done the comparator work, and now let's take a look at how those agree. Did we try and achieve the same thing in terms of the inputs to both? And did we actually achieve that in terms of the outputs of both? Right? So that's the validation arm. We have verification is one step, we have validation as one part, and then the last part is the applicability. And when we think about model and simulation generally, right, we generally cannot validate everything we want to do, right? The very reason for using a model in device applications is because we want to use it to generate insights into things that we cannot generate in other ways, which almost necessarily means that whatever I'm going to use to validate the model, right, I'm going to have to make a leap from that space to where I actually want to apply it to evaluate the device. And that's the idea of applicability. It's an assessment of the different material properties, boundary conditions, geometries that we use in the validation study. How close are those to what we envisioned for the actual context of use? The sorts of measurable quantities that we can measure in a benchtop test to demonstrate validation, right? Are those the same quantities of interest? Are they the same outcomes that we want to use within the simulation to address the context of use? That's the idea of applicability. Nowhere in here is VNV40 trying to say, you know, for my particular study, this is how you do the verification validation. That's not the goal here. The goal is evaluate your risk, think about credibility, think about the different verification validation activities that you can use to generate evidence credibility, and then tell me that story looking at all these different contributions. So how do we do for this one? So I'm going to pull another document from the recent literature. This is one that was published about a year ago, using specifically VNV40 to establish credibility of a pedicle screw system. And so within this system, you can see I'm kind of gravitating towards orthopedics, but I think you probably know why that is. This is an example of the basic test method, right? So there's two blocks which are representing vertebra, and you have these rods here which are connecting, and then you have the screws that are engaged with the vertebra and provide the full mechanical connectivity, right? So that's the overall system that this particular study was taking a look at. And in support of this study, the authors put forward some validation evidence where they took a look at, so this is a basic uniaxial test, again, a relatively simple mechanical system. You're compressing it axially, you have an axial force, you can take a look at the displacement, which is having to do with the overall compliance in the system. And you can show that, okay, we have some experimental data there, which are pretty tight. It's a pretty well-controlled mechanical test. There were a number of different contributors to the study who each did a simulation of this construct, and they all showed that the force versus displacement response from the model was pretty darn close to that from the experiment, right? And many of us would look at this and say, okay, that's wonderful, right? It's a validated model. Let's go with it. The interesting part for me of this study is it really engages on the question of applicability. If I think back to my experience again over 20 years in this industry, there's a lot of very loose language around our model is validated, right? Therefore, we can use it for this purpose, right? The whole essence of applicability really gets at that. So we've done some validation activities, which is great, but is that enough to support an application where I'm wanting to make a decision on a device in this space? And in particular, the thought experiment in this paper was, okay, we have this validation data here. Now we want to take a look at the impact of different design decisions on these screws that are engaged with the vertebra, right? And so we're looking at stress within these screws between a non-cannulated and a cannulated system. And we would like to be able to support a conclusion that essentially we see no difference in stress. We're using a validated model, right? Therefore, we're good to go. And again, this is interesting because it really challenges all of us, I think, to contemplate how we can use validation data from one aspect of the system to support decisions on other aspects of the system. And it's not necessarily easy, right? What VNV40 does is it gives us a structure in which to think about that, a structure in which to talk about that with colleagues and with regulators. What we see in practice is that there is still a lot of variability in how this is done. I will also add to this that several of us on the webinar here today, we are working on a simulation book, right? A book that more comprehensively samples what is the state of modeling simulation, specifically within medical devices. And within that, we have a handful of chapters written by a number of practitioners from across the industry who, within their own technical space, are looking to apply VNV40 in practice. And what we see is there remains a lot of variability in how to take this process of VNV40 and how to apply it consistently and well within case studies. So that part of the process still requires, I think, a little bit of work, but the steps are there and the mechanism for thinking about this, the mechanism for dialoguing about this has been provided. Now let me jump to the third one that I want to talk to. And so VNV40 came out in 2018. In 2021, the FDA, the US FDA came out with a draft document around specifically credibility of CMS in medical device submissions. So very similar to VNV40, but now really leaning into what does this mean specifically for medical device submissions, specifically within the United States. And you see that this then was published definitively a little over a year ago at this point. And the key point here that I want to highlight is the FDA really leaned into these aspects of verification and validation, right? And they took the next step of saying within the broader landscape of devices, we see a lot of different areas where you can generate evidence to support credibility. Some of these are very similar to what we would have seen already within VNV40. So you see code verification, that is a specific line item within VNV40. benchtop validation results. This is very similar to what we have within VNV40 in terms of the validation, the validation activities. But they identified some gaps, right? And so a couple that I want to highlight is one of model calibration. So any of us in the simulation side know that if you keep on digging deeper and deeper and deeper, right, almost any modeling story has some aspect of calibration embedded in that. And that's true whether we're dealing with physics-based approaches, whether we're dealing with empirical-based approaches, right? Calibration is in there. Interesting thing from this FDA guidance is calibration can also provide credibility, right? So we need not hide it. Let's talk about it. Let's be clear about what has been, where are the calibration activities versus the validation activities. Another point that I want to highlight is this category 4, which is focusing still on validation, but now looking at validation against in vivo data, right? Either in vivo data based on individual patients, individual subjects, or in vivo data that comes across populations of cohorts, right? It's nice to think that we can always have a well-controlled benchtop test for validation as we try and push the envelope on application of medical devices, right? We're trying to bring simulation closer and closer to the clinic, closer to decisions around patients, right? And as we closer and closer to that, right, there's more of an expectation, I think, to go from not just benchtop validation, but validation against clinical data. And the FDA guidance came out, identified different ways to look at that. And they even went the next step of saying, well, if you're doing traditional benchtop tests of these different 8 categories of evidence, probably do these 2 or 3 categories, right? But if you are trying to do software as a medical device, right? If you're trying to do in-silico clinical studies, right? More of these categories, we probably expect to see them in the materials that you're generating, right? So a very nice playbook of, at least within one part of the global environment, right? What is necessary to instill the level of trust in the simulations that we're producing. Practice, we don't know about this one yet, right? This came out a year and a half ago. I don't have a clear case study to share with you on the effectiveness of this. I think there we will all wait and see how that story emerges. So if I now rewind to the beginning and wrap up and then pass on to others, why should patients, clinicians trust us, right? Why can we use CM&S for good intentions and effectively to support medical devices? We have the process. We really do. The process is not perfect, right? But if you rewind to the landscape of things 15, 20 years ago versus where we are now, we've highlighted, we've leaned into a couple of very key elements, right? How do we present the work that was done? How do we establish appropriate levels of verification, validation, evidence? How do we report on those levels? If we follow the process, right, then we've taken a very significant step, I think, to instilling trust in the results that come from that. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop my first blurb. I am now going to hand it off to Mark Horner from ANSYS, and Mark is going to talk about a couple other efforts within the ASME VVUQ committees, as well as the topic of good simulation practices. Mark, all yours.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the great overview. Just one second. Now, can I get a confirmation that you all can see my screen?
It's getting there. It's not yet in full screen mode. Perfect.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it. Great introduction. And yeah, motivation for, this discussion today. I really appreciate it. That was a really nice opening. So what I'll talk about then is some other efforts that are happening within ASME that are complementary to the work that we're doing in ASME VNV40. So I'm just going to call it ASME 40. I just can't get the VNV out of my head. Because I've also been a longtime member of the ASME 40 group, similar to Jeff. So, there in the early days when the committee was first forming and developing its charter. And then, along with Jeff, who's chair right now, I'm also serving as co-vice chair with Payman Afshari, who many of you also probably know. So anyway, what I'll talk about are ASME 70 and ASME 80 and the activities that are happening there. You'll find out why in just a second. And then, as Jeff mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about the Good Simulation Practice book that was published just last year. Okay. So for ASME 70, there, as you probably know, there are a number of different subcommittees that are all reporting up to the overall standards committee within ASME that's focused on verification, validation, uncertainty quantification. Some of those are more physics-based, like 10 and 20, that are focused on FEA and CFD. Then there are others that are industry-based, similar to 40 or 30 in nuclear. But then there's this group around 70 that's focused on VVUQ of machine learning. Their charter was approved in 2019. You can read it here. They're really laser focused on, establishing VVUQ best practices that establish the credibility of AI and ML models in an industry agnostic way. So they're not necessarily focused on a specific industry. Although there are a number of members from that group that are part of the nuclear industry. And so while they haven't yet published a standard, they have published a document that talks about some of their early thoughts on how one would go about establishing the credibility of ML models. And that is focused on it's focused on an application that's related to manufacturing parts that would be used in a nuclear reactor. And so the idea is that we potentially want to use a computational model to help us to understand the quality of those parts that are being developed. The process that they're using is a little bit different from the VMV40 process that we have, and you'll see that in just a second. It's actually based on something called goal structuring notation, and it's a procedure and process that was built by the Safety Critical Systems Club, which is a UK group that's focused on sharing knowledge and developing best practices around system safety. And so they published a standard starting back in 2011, I think, was the first one that was published. And now they're up to their third version, which came out in 2021, if I remember correctly. And so they're focused on, this concept of goal structuring notation. So what it is a graphical argument notation that allows you to document explicitly the claims you're making about a specific subject. What's the contributing evidence that goes into those claims, and then how is the evidence related back to the goals? And so it's a flowchart method similar to what you see in VMV40, but it takes a little bit of a different approach, and I'll show you that on the next slide. And so what they have are different elements, similar to flowcharts, where you have, decision, diamonds that represent decisions within a flowchart, ovals that represent the beginning of a flowchart or an end. They take a similar approach, but in this case, they identify things that are called goals, which are rectangular shaped, and they present a claim about your argument. They have strategies, which then describe the different activities that you would need to consider when substantiating a goal. They also have solutions. So if you generate evidence that will help to substantiate a goal, that specific evidence, textual or what have you, would be contained within a circle, and presumably you would point to a document of some sort. And then they have other elements as well. There's actually a few others that I didn't have room for on the slide. I just picked a few just so you could see them. Hopefully get an appreciation for those kind of primary elements of a decision tree. And so here's an example that they publish within the document. And so the idea is that you have a primary goal. That primary goal sits at the very top of your flow chart, and it's a claim that you want to make. Primary goals can be broken down into sub goals, and eventually those sub goals are discretized further and further until you arrive at base goals. And the idea is that if you can satisfy the base goals that are associated with a given activity, then those propagate up the credibility such that you have satisfied the claim associated with your primary goal. Okay. And then all the decisions that you made, the evidence, et cetera, is it captured or pointed to within, different elements of this chart. And so this example here focuses on, and I'm zooming up on my screen, hopefully making this a little easier for you to see. Maybe you can see that as well. But it's focused on a fuel control software system. And so what they do is say, okay, is our fuel control system software safe? Right now, what they do is they show one sub goal under that main goal. So just one, presumably there are many different sub goals. This sub goal is specifically focused on the fuel control itself. Okay. And that the element that's controlling the fuel that gets to the engine. And so what they need to understand is the different hazards that are associated with that fuel control element. And the primary hazards that they have are in these two rectangular boxes in the middle, and those are related to fuel exhaustion. So that's where we completely run out of fuel, or there's fuel starvation, where we're not supplying enough fuel to the system. You can see under that, then eventually you get down to these base goals, and the base goals related to fuel exhaustion are ones that talk about, okay, what is the control and management of the software that's associated with jettisoning the fuel? Essentially, we're just releasing all the fuel out of the wings to the ground. And then there's also software that's related to tracking how much fuel we have left in the plane. And so that's also tracked in that second box from the left. And then finally, on fuel starvation, that talks about things like cutoff valves and how they're managed, how fuel distribution through the system is managed, et cetera. So just a quick example to give you an idea about how how the goal structuring notation works. And so they then applied this for the nuclear example that they developed. So this is totally an eye chart. If the last thing you thought wasn't an eye chart, this one really is. And so just really what I want to highlight here is that there are some parallels to the framework that Jeff was talking about, in that, we have a reality of interest at the top. We have empirical data that forms our comparator that Jeff was talking about, that we're going to use for the validation. So we have to understand how that data is collected, how it's managed, how it's treated, et cetera. So there are goals, sub goals, and then finally base goals associated with that. There's the mathematical model and justifying that it's executed correctly and how it's developed. And then finally, there are a number of different activities around validation. And so you can see, again, I'd refer you back to the paper if you want to learn more. But essentially, what I'm trying to get across to you here is this is the general direction that this group is heading in terms of developing their credibility framework. Some other elements that they do talk about within the paper, I think, are important, but we're also very used to hearing about when it comes to AI and ML models, are separation of the training and validation data. So it's critical that when it comes to the validation data that you use to establish the credibility of a database model, that the model has never seen that data before, right? So we're going to train that model up. Hopefully, we're getting a great agreement between the training data and what's being predicted by the model. And then finally, we're going to validate it to justify that. Then something else they highlight that is a really nice overlap between V and V40 is the relationship between the validation domain and the use domain. And so what this talks about then is, how critical it is to establish, that you're operating within that validation domain when you start to make predictions based on the model. That's important for physics-based models. But presumably, with a physics-based model, because we have physics underlying the predictions that we're making, extrapolation maybe isn't as risky as it would be with database models, where, the credibility of database models really starts to deteriorate quite quickly as we move outside of that validation space. This document and the framework that they are pursuing isn't without precedent as well. There is a credibility assessment framework document around critical boiling transition that was published by the NRC back in 2016, and it follows this goal structuring notation approach. Okay, so this is something that they're already using and implementing, and it represents, according to the document, what they say is years and years of experience that they've developed within the NRC. And essentially, they're encapsulating that experience in this document. So this seems really to be the direction that they're heading. And I'll talk about this in the context of what's happening here in the US in just a minute. So I think it is important to kind of understand where they're going, because it does bring about some differences between the approach that NRC is taking and what's happening in the US versus what we're seeing within the FDA. Okay, so now speaking of FDA, let's talk about verification, validation, and pharma and biopharma. And this is specifically for the ASME 80 subcommittee. So I'll talk about, kind of a little bit of a timeline for the 80 subcommittee and how they got to where they are today. But, some of the things that drove the development of the 80 subcommittee is that, one, a little bit of maybe jealousy or envy. We're seeing that there are a lot of great things happening in the medical device space with ASME 40, but still questions remained. ASME 40 wasn't necessarily able to address, for example, some of the things I was talking about in the previous section, which were related to AI, ML, database modeling in general. So where I was ending up on this slide was just talking about the critical importance of the use of models that are part of automated process control within the biopharmaceutical space. Essentially, digital twins are now the future when it comes to optimizing pharmaceutical manufacturing processes. So the question is, how do we qualify those digital twin models sufficiently, not only internally, but then also communicate that credibility to the regulatory authorities. So as a timeline for the ASME 80 subcommittee, we had our first meeting back in October of 2021. I was actually the convener of that meeting. And the reason for that were some of those reasons I mentioned previously. They related to the fact that, we're seeing a lot of success with the ASME 40 standard. And the question is, how can we translate that success into the, pharmaceutical, and biopharmaceutical community? We had kind of a, it was one step to get to know each other, to identify white space and maybe understand some of the best practices that companies were already using. We held a virtual V&V symposium over several months. And so we had 1-hour meetings once a month where, different companies came and kind of shared some of the best practices that they're following around verification, validation, and uncertainty quantification. And this was really important because I felt like it was a way for us to get to know each other, for us to kind of harden in our mind what verification means, what is validation, what are the differences, and then to potentially, hopefully, identify some white space that we could pursue within this community. So then finally, in March of 2023, after a few more months of discussion, we wound up getting formal approval of our subcommittee, and now, today we're developing initial work products. So, the first product that we're developing is a position paper, and I put beneath that real world. And one thing I will say is this, what I'm talking about here today, especially on the middle and right-hand side of this slide, are my idea for potential future directions. This is nothing that's set in stone or necessarily, been solidified as the future direction for our group. But I just want to give you an idea of where I think we're headed in terms of the community. So first off, we're writing this position paper. We're about halfway done right now. It talks about, how modeling and simulation is used in pharma, what is the impact that it's making, talks a little bit about, the fundamentals of VVUQ, also goes into regulatory, and then we go into some case studies. And so the idea is that we take the VVUQ best practices from V&V 40 and start to apply those within the pharmaceutical industry. And, my idea now, if we go into that middle section, is one potential future outcome for us could be a standard that's an example standard. And it essentially, recognizes V&V 40 as a risk-based framework for physics-based models that would be relevant for the pharmaceutical industry. And then just starts to work through some examples to demonstrate how to apply the V&V 40 standard within pharma. One of the impacts that this could have is it could help us to get recognition, for example, by the FDA. So because, there's a missing link or missing element within the V&V 40 standard, from the FDA perspective, that, there are no pharma examples in there. So why would a CBER or a CEDR recognize V&V 40? By developing this standard, we could potentially, address that weakness. And then finally, as a longer term objective, we start to develop that model credibility standard. So identify properly the white space, potentially that white space is around developing and validating models that are not only physics-based, but also data-based and then hybrid models. So really spanning that spectrum from mechanistic to database models. I think this is something that could be really helpful for industry. This does bring up one, I did also want to mention some recent FDA draft guidance, which talks about the use of artificial intelligence to support, decision-making for drugs and biological products. They mention a number of different use cases within that document, and one of those is, manufacturing. So already potentially giving us a head start in terms of the work that we might want to do on the ASME 80 subcommittee. One of the things that we see there, though, is that, it's really focused, that standard's really focused on adapting the ASME 40 framework to, AI and ML models. Okay. And so this potentially brings up a conflict. I would say that, FDA and ASME so far have been more or less harmonized in terms of our approach to, validation approaches for computational modeling and simulation. That's on the physics-based side. But now we potentially see a bifurcation where FDA is going one way in terms of seeing, can we expand and adapt the V&V 40 framework to this new type of model, which is an AI model. Whereas ASME seems to be heading towards this goal structuring notation approach. So we'll see how all this plays out, but there potentially is some conflict there, and we'll see how it goes. Something else I did want to highlight here. I know here we're today talking about a UK CEiRSI for medical devices, but there is also a UK CEiRSI focused on pharmaceutical manufacturing. And so that's another area within the UK where we could potentially get some critical information that would specifically help us within the 80 community and then pharma and biopharma in general. So really excited to see, the outcomes, the progress and outcomes from that group. The last thing I was asked to talk about then was good simulation practice in the book that was published just last year. And so this book was developed via a community of practice activity by In-Silico World. So essentially what In-Silico World was a transient group that was led by Marco Vicciconti as well as Luca Emili. I think many of us on the phone know them. This was in collaboration with the VPH Institute, which is a group of academics primarily in Europe who are focused on in silico medicine, and then the Avicena Alliance, which is a policy arm focused on getting recognition for in silico medicine globally. And so what we did was to come together through a consensus process and identify the key elements of good simulation practice. The idea being that we would mirror ultimately, what we would mirror, and develop a document that could one day become something like a good laboratory practice, a good clinical practice, et cetera. And so this book was published as open access. Definitely want to highlight that. As we share those slides, you'll be able to get the link, embedded the link to many of the documents that I referred to within my presentation. So either search for this book online to get it if you haven't heard of it, or you can find it when you watch the recording that was published just last year. I think what's really exciting about publishing this through Springer is we get some metrics. We've already seen like 38,000 downloads in the last year since it was published. So really exciting to see that this message around good simulation practice is spreading. Just to give you a quick overview, because I'm running out of time, some of the elements that we identify and start to define within the book are, things around model development. Model development in Chapter 4 is important because you're identifying some of the software quality assurance best practices that are associated with model development, and essentially developing that software that you'll use within potentially a clinical scenario. The software itself is an artifact. How do we ensure the quality of that artifact? Model credibility, as you can imagine, there's a lot of talk about VMV40 in there in the VMV40 framework. Some other interesting things that come up in other chapters, for example, are, how do we ensure that in silico medicine and computational models are appropriately assessed within a clinical environment? So, for example, we often go through an institutional review board, and the question is whether or not we have representation of people who would understand the use and implications of computational modeling and simulation within a clinical study. And so when it comes to ethical review, we unpack a little bit of that in that chapter. So anyway, a lot of different things that we're covering within the book. I definitely recommend you check it out. And then finally, Jeff, I added this at the last second. You mentioned the VVUQ book. I really see the book that Jeff Payman and I are working on as a complement to the GSP book. It's kind of, GSP is at a high level. It's saying, here's some of the, things that we need to keep in mind when we're developing models. And then the question is, what do we do then around implementation? And so within the GSP book, within the VVUQ book, we have 4 different sections. There's a section around, introduction and fundamentals of model credibility. So there are chapters in there about verification, validation, uncertainty quantification, and then the VMV40 standard itself. And these are all written by a variety of experts, in the field. Section 2 is regulatory considerations. So there we have 5 chapters that are covering what's happening in the US and around the world, and then also in EMA. And also we have a chapter on nuclear. And then finally, the main body of this work is really where the rubber hits the road. How do we apply, VMV40 or verification, validation, uncertainty quantification, best practices, et cetera? How are those being applied today within the medical device industry? That's section 3. And then finally, section 4 is emerging topics. So we have, information in there around, database models and how do we potentially, it's a really nice chapter that talks about how do we potentially extend the VMV40 framework to incorporate assessment of database models. They even go as far within that chapter to talk about what potential new credibility factors could be. So this is something where we're almost there. You see, there's a lot of chapters, 24 chapters to the book. 21 of those chapters are complete, and we're in the home stretch just finalizing these last 3 chapters. So really excited to be able to share this with the community, hopefully by the end of springtime. And again, similar to the Good Simulation Practice book, it's open access. So we're really excited to be able to share this generally with the community. So with that, Jeff, then I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you. Thanks everyone for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Mark number 2. Good morning.
Oh, I got to turn off sharing, I think. My apologies, just real quick. I'm sorry. There you go, Mark. You should have it now.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you everyone for the opportunity to share this work with you. Just a little bit of background. Apologies that Tina Morrison couldn't join us today. She was the co-author of this presentation. What I'm sharing with you today is material that we shared in a public conference with the FDA last autumn, and where it extends on the work that was done by the Reagan-Udall Foundation. So just a background, the FDA convened a group of about 100 members through the Reagan-Udall Foundation that was the facilitator for the project. And the initial idea was that we're going to further explore the good simulation practice idea. But as the group performed several sprints to identify the direction of the work, the mood and the framework for everything shifted. So the conclusion of the group was that we have more documentation around modeling and simulation as a source of evidence than we do for bench testing, for animal studies, or for clinical studies. So despite the volume of all this verification, validation, uncertainty quantification type of work that goes into establishing the rigor of the computational modeling approach, the idea was that, or the sentiment was that the stakeholders, like the business decision makers and regulatory affairs personnel, were not at the same level of confidence in modeling and simulation as the practitioners were. So the resulting document here that we're going to discuss was an effort to build the trust among the other stakeholders in the modeling and in the healthcare ecosystem, and really try to address the concerns of business leaders and regulatory affairs personnel, both on the advantages and opportunities that lie with the use of modeling and simulation. So with that, I'm going to launch into perhaps an off-color riddle. But I was at a cardiovascular conference a couple of years ago, and I think a few of the other folks on the call were there. One of the speakers posed this riddle, and it was, what's the difference between a surgeon and an engineer? And the answer was that a surgeon only kills one person at a time. So if we think about the kind of the roots of modeling and simulation, and where modeling and simulation and physics really took off was in World War II, and it was developing weapon systems. But now when we look at where we are now in 2025, we're computational modelers, scientists, digital transformation leaders that are looking at these computational models or computational techniques for application in healthcare. And this raises a huge opportunity for us when we think about the moral, ethical, and societal obligations that we have. So the first is to minimize the exposure of patients to unproven therapies. The second is to ensure that we have these cost-effective therapies that enter the healthcare system. And then the third is to protect patients from quality and manufacturing issues after the products enter the market. So these are the problems to be solved, or the questions of interest that from a business perspective and from a moral and ethical perspective drive the opportunity for modeling and simulation in the space. So looking at some data, this is the regulatory pathway for complex medical devices. We're looking at the 3 stages of where the device first encounters a human in the life cycle. So there's the feasibility study, the pivotal study, and the FDA approval. And the vertical axis represents how many products are in the pipeline at each of these stages, and this is giving us a picture of the attrition. So if we look at 100 complex medical devices that enter this clinical phase of testing, only about 30 of those 100 will receive FDA approval. And during that process, approximately 13,000 of the 31,000 patients that are involved on average in those studies are exposed to devices that remain investigational and do not advance to the market. So 41% of these patients are exposed to products that do not advance on the market. If we look at the pharmaceutical side of the story, it's much more sobering. So this graph is constructed the same way. The number of products on the vertical axis, and then the attrition over each of the phases in the product life cycle. In this case, for every 100 drugs that enter clinical testing, only 5 will receive FDA approval. And in the process, 68% of the patients that were exposed to these drugs were exposed to drugs that will never make it to the market or remain in the investigational phase. So that's the human exposure side of the story. Let's look at something that's a little more business focused. So these are graphs showing the cost and the time distribution across each of those clinical phases, with the medical devices on the left, the pharmaceutical devices on the right, and how much money is spent in each of those clinical phases. So the phase 2 part of the trial is where a huge amount of expense occurs in the medical device side. And again, the most amount of time is spent there. We're looking at a total average time of about 13 years to make it through this process and make it to the market. And the costs that are shown here are costs associated with conducting the clinical study. It's not the costs associated with like the people time inside the company, maintaining that project team, and all of those other costs that are associated with running your business during the course of this time. And then on the pharmaceutical side, you can see that it's skewed more towards the latter phases. The cost and the size of those studies, the amount of time that you spend in those studies increases from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. And again, I was surprised to find that complex medical devices follow roughly the same average time to market as pharmaceuticals do, about 13 years in both cases, which is a huge amount of time in the In-Silico world. Over the course of 13 years, products, software tools have become obsolete. Computer systems have undergone profound changes. The operating systems you started with are also obsolete. So if you think about the regulatory requirements for how you perform your simulations, perform your In-Silico studies, and how you're required to track these over the time that you're bringing your product to the market, and then after the product is on the market, this just does not lend itself to the speed at which In-Silico is moving today. So then the third piece of the ethical story is related to recalls. So these are some statistics on medical device recalls and pharmaceutical recalls. Class 2 recalls were responsible for roughly 90% of all the medical device recalls in the US. And the primary root cause was or quality related, or the product being out of specification in manufacturing. And then on the pharma side, the primary driver is deviations from the good manufacturing practices related to the pharmaceutical products. But what is more sobering is that the amount of recalls recently are hitting all-time highs. So it's a 3-year high in medical devices. It's a 10-year high in pharmaceuticals. And the pressure to get products on the market is likely exacerbating this. The need for companies to move faster and faster to remain competitive and to remain profitable is likely contributing to this. So we've talked about the problem. We've talked about what needs to be solved. Let's talk about how In-Silico technologies can be part of the solution. So and I'd like to point out here just real quick that there are some extra slides in here that were not included in the FDA presentation last fall. They were cut due to brevities, but the ones that are marked with an asterisk are those that have been resurrected from the cutting room floor for this presentation. So the first one here is the executive summary, and it's just highlighting that In-Silico technologies complement existing in vitro and in vivo methods, and it is viewed as favorable by decision makers because it helps arrive at more informed decisions, more broadly investigated products, with the idea that this will drive improved safety, quality, and effectiveness. So the definition that's used throughout the Reagan-Udall paper is that in silico technologies are computer-based. They're simulations and techniques that involve both causal models and data-driven models, and they analyze and they predict the behavior of complex processes. And as we've heard already, they're used throughout a number of other industries that are highly safety-driven or highly regulated industries. So the paper also does a great job of zeroing in on the value proposition from a business perspective and from a regulatory perspective on the value of these in silico clinical technologies. So the first and probably the most important is the foreshortened time to market and the extended duration of exclusivity for the products that enter the market using modeling and simulation and data-driven computational methods. I will return to this in a moment. The other part is it enables the businesses to enter multiple markets at the same time. It shortens the clinical trial phase that we just took a look at and looked at how significant of a portion of the product life cycle those clinical trials are for complex medical devices and for pharma. They improve patient outcomes, they enhance product safety. Recalls really damage the brand of a company. So this provides a barrier or protection for the brand reputation. It improves the design for reliability and sustainability in manufacturing, and it builds towards that reduce, refine, replace, the 3 R's that we've been pursuing using in silico technologies. So I'm circling back to this time to market piece because it has the most overwhelming impact of the economics around the use of in silico technologies. So the first product of its kind that's on the market will usually have market exclusivity for about 3 to 4 years, according to the literature. And then the first mover advantage means that the first person to enter the market will usually enjoy a dominant market share for more than 10 years after the launch. So any technologies that accelerate the product life cycle, that help the product or the manufacturer get to the market faster, will these market forces dominate the economic picture for the technology? And yes, modeling and simulation is an added cost to the system. But when we tie the use of modeling and simulation and in silico technologies to these powerful economic drivers, it gives enormous justification for the investment. The next thing that is discussed is just the role of the different sources of evidence that both Jeff and Mark have alluded to before. So when we look at in silico technologies, we are looking at computational techniques along with real world evidence, along with animal studies, laboratory testing, and human clinical studies. But the in silico technologies become a repository for that knowledge and allows the acceleration of evidence generation and more robust evidence generation. The other part that's mentioned is the need for the data infrastructure and the computing infrastructure to support bringing all of these sources of evidence together. So that is a big part of enabling the application of in silico technology to the business. So this is a graph that some of you have seen before because it comes from a paper that was published by the FDA team back in 2017. But this graph has been updated and modified to include a column for in silico technology. So for those of you who haven't seen it before, what it's looking at are these different criteria for or considerations for the different types of evidence, and whether the different sources of evidence are good, fair or minimal in their ability to address each of these questions. So I don't intend for you to read all of them, but what the graph shows is that each source of evidence, whether it's clinical, animal studies, bench, or computer modeling and simulation, they all have different strengths and weaknesses. However, the leveraging in-silico technology actually pulls together components of all of these different evidence sources into the in-silico technology piece. And this is the most rapidly growing area of evidence generation. It's the most rapidly advancing set of technologies. I don't know why my slides are going crazy. It's the most rapidly advancing a piece of the technology picture right now, and it's outpacing advances in all of the other areas. So this is another graph that will be familiar to many of you, and it's looking at the evolution of in-silico methods applied to the product lifecycle. So this first curve is illustrating the conventional build and test method. Across the horizontal axis is the product lifecycle, and on the vertical axis are the number of problems that are resolved. And then the curve is representing how many of those problems appear and when they are addressed in the product lifecycle. And these gray bars are these multiplication factors on how much it costs to address the problem. So what this graph is showing is that with conventional build and test methods that are discovered late, when problems arise late in the product lifecycle, they're really expensive to address. And then the introduction of CAE methods, CAD-based methods, caused a shift to the left in terms of identifying problems. So some industries have reported that this resulted in a 50 to 60% improvement in the quality of their products and a significant reduction in post-market problems. So what has been driving that is that the design changes happen earlier in the product lifecycle at less expense. It improves the quality of the handoff from the R&D phase into the manufacturing phase, and it reduces the number of out of specification issues associated with manufacturing and quality. And then the third piece is the introduction of in-silico technologies, so things like computational modeling, physics-based methods, and now real-world evidence and AI has caused a profound shift in the ability to identify those problems much earlier in the product lifecycle, where they're the cheapest and easiest to address. And that has improved even further the quality and reduce the cost and reduce the amount of recalls related to the product lines that are able to leverage these technologies. So in conclusion, the Reagan-Udall report then is driving at this near future where there's this virtuous cycle around the in-silico technologies, where these different sources of evidence, bench, animal testing, computer modeling, human simulation, and real-world evidence are actually accumulating inside the in-silico technology and continues to improve its predictive power, which is critically important for something as complex as the human body and physiology, as well as the complex interaction between devices and pharmaceuticals with the human body. So it's viewed as a complementary source of evidence. It accelerates product development. It helps with achieving first pass success against this existing standards. We can screen before entering human testing. It reduces the cost, time, and the amount of human and animal testing that needs to be done. And it drives affordable and safe therapies. So the call to action for the regulatory community and those participating in the meeting last autumn were these three things. So to promote in-silico technologies, to harness the power of in-silico technologies, and to drive adoption of in-silico technologies. So on the promotion side, we want the FDA wants to encourage the use of in-silico technologies to vet safety and where possible effectiveness prior to human testing. And they don't want us to wait until there's a product recall to apply in-silico technologies as a forensic tool. The other one is to urge the companies to harness in-silico technologies and to capitalize and streamline the knowledge accumulation process and to accelerate innovation from one product lifecycle to the next. And then the third is to drive pervasive adoption of in-silico technologies to decrease development time and increase profitability. And this in turn will have a profound impact on the cost to the entire healthcare ecosystem. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all the contributors from academia, industry, and regulatory bodies that participated in the creation of that report from the Reagan-Udall Foundation. And this is a list of all the references for the graphs as well as the report itself that were shown throughout the presentation. So these will be available to you after the session.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Next up, Brandon. I invite you to come on and bring us home.
Awesome. Laura, do you have the slides, or do you want me to share them?
Are you happy to share them, or I can share them from my end?
I'll share mine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Hopefully everyone can see my slide. Sure. First, thank you everyone for sitting through this seminar. I know it's afternoon over across the pond, and hopefully we've provided some really good value to you with your time. My name is Brandon Lurie. I'm a principal modeling and simulation engineer with Gore Medical. I'm also the co-leader of the ASME V&V40 Working Group 2. And our goal was to create an end-to-end example that I'll preview for you today. From conception to approval, it took us about 6 years, which seems like a long time. But on the left, it's me when we started the work, just a little after we started the work. And since we're all technical folks here, I don't want to make a claim without actually thinking through or giving you some of the potential confounding evidence. So this is me on the left, just starting out, and me on the right when we finished. So my claim to you is that doing validation verification work is actually a de-aging process. On the left, you can see I have some gray hair. On the right, no gray hair to be seen. So I hope you guys will continue on this journey with us. You can see the benefits, at least for me. Early on, Jeff talked about the V&V40. I want to give you a little bit of a rehash of what it is and what it isn't. That'll help us understand the value of the end-to-end example. So it's meant to be broad, and it can be used for non-patient safety applications, whether medical device or something else. We've designed this for medical device, but we've already had many conversations with other groups that see the V&V40 framework as something very valuable for making risk-based VVUQ decisions. But it does actually require risk. So something without risk, this would not be a good tool. It formalizes the credibility factors, the processes that we would need to walk through to make a decision if the model is credible. Instead of just kind of some abstract, like looked at the review, he said, this is good work, I'm happy with it. It details each aspect of credibility and creates a process for us to have a conversation with the stakeholders and regulators to show why we think this is a credible model. But there are some things it does not do. For instance, it's not specific to a medical device type. There's not set rules on how to actually go through the VVUQ process. And it's possible to have some credibility factors that aren't actually applicable to your work, or missing credibility factors that could be useful. Jeff had mentioned earlier patient-specific modeling, and maybe there's some aspects of that should be considered that are not brought up within the current standard. But most of all, the takeaway of what V&V40 is not, is it's not prescriptive. It creates a framework, but it does not create a set rules that you just follow line by line. So now that we've covered V&V40, let's talk about the benefit of creating an end-to-end example. So the example that we created is a tibial tray component. And for those of you guys that are not in orthopedics, you may look at this and say, oh, this is simple, or it's not related to your work. But we think that it's a real world, realistic example. The biggest thing when we look at medical devices is that when we do validation, the quantity of interest from our validation may not align with the quantity of interest for our context of use. Using a stent example, a lot of our validation will be radial pressure over an in vivo range, whereas what we're trying to model and understand would be fatigue and its durability. The example itself covers almost the entire process in detail, with the exception of the documentation and evidence portion. So it doesn't walk through how to actually write out your report for submission, but it covers everything else. What it does have within each credibility factor, within each topic, it gives a description of the guidance, and that's available not from V&V40, but other sources as well. Our options that we created for the plan, what was selected, the results of the work, a conclusion, and then a discussion on how we made this decision, and if we needed a higher level of credibility, what we could have done. So it sounds really straightforward, and you say to yourself, why did this take 6 years? The simple answer, of course, is that we learned along the way, and it does have a whole modeling simulation community, and getting us all to agree on the best practice took a little bit of time. But in addition to that, there's also some credibility factors. How to address them wasn't readily apparent. So the first is model risk. And model risk we define as the combination of the influence of the model, so the results, on the decision, plus the consequence is if you make an incorrect decision. And how to agree on what those consequences might be when you think about their severity and their probability, especially when there's potentially multiple consequences. We don't want to have every single one of our devices end up with death as a potential consequence, even if it's highly improbable. So coming up with a process that we can consistently walk through and come up with somewhat consistent results and options is something we had to figure out. Additionally, each credibility factor has a continuum of options. Greater rigor, just more work, usually more work that can give you greater credibility of the model. And how to link what your model risk is to each credibility factor, what the intended work is, was not clear. So it wasn't set out by the NV40. And so we had to consider multiple options on how to get there and how to justify on something that's fairly subjective what is required for this level of credibility. And then how do we actually compare the simulation data? Assuming many of you do computational modeling, you've probably said, well, I've compared my simulation output to my validation or benchtop data, and we're all within 5%. But where do we get 5 or 10%? How do we justify that? And what happens when we include uncertainty within either sets of the data? How do we make that kind of comparison? And then applicability. It's something that we don't necessarily think about when we start off our modeling simulation career. We say, okay, well, we have our device, we have our how we want this to work. Let's do a validation testing, simulate it, and look, we're close. But there's potential that the validation you work really isn't applicable to what your context of use model. And then there's also the potential that your context of use model is not applicable to what your real world concern is. I'm sure many of you have probably seen models where you say, yes, this is what we're trying to replicate, but is this actually a real good replication? Or have you made too many simplifications or just have something that's adjacent to it, but it's not really applicable to what you're trying to determine? So again, when we do modeling, we're trying to make a decision. We're creating a tool. And a fair question to always ask is the work that we've done or we plan on doing actually applicable to what the decision we're trying to make? So that all sounds great. Hopefully all of you are very excited to see this document, which is not in print yet, though it has been approved. But we have a couple more things for you. The first is the workflow for going through and actually doing VNV planning and execution. When you look at VNV40, you think, hey, it's pretty straightforward. I identify the credit for each credibility factor, I make a goal, I work on meeting each goal, and then I say I'm great. But in reality, some of the credibility factors, goals that you might select, can be dependent upon the results of execution of other credibility factors. And coming up with a plan of how the order that you want to do this work is, again, not straightforward. So in Appendix C, there's a summary of how one could have approached the work that we did, step by step, planning, execution, planning, execution. In Appendix B, I briefly described the applicability challenges. There's a step-by-step process for diving deep into asking important questions of, is your validation model relevant, applicable to your computational model for your COU? Is your COU relevant, applicable to the testing or the actual decision you're gonna make? So I know this has been a long seminar, and frequently it's hard to get some takeaways and remember them. So I wanted to just give you a quick list of what I think is most important. First is that VNV 40 gets you on the path. It doesn't have all the information you need, but it gets you on the path for doing risk-based modeling validation. But things like identifying the risk, selecting credibility goal, and how to meet the credibility goal may not be obvious for your work. VVUQ 40.1 provides one example of how to apply VNV 40. And here's the biggest takeaway. What we do is subjective, which is not something that's easy for us. We're technical folks. We like to think of the worlds in somewhat deterministic method means. And you want to walk in and say, my VVQ plan should be the same as my neighbor's, as the next person for the same application. But it's subjective. It's about risk and making a plan based on how to show others that your model is credible. So just make an honest effort. And at the very least, by using the VNV40 framework, you create the ability to have a common language with your stakeholders and regulators. So that's it. Thank you for your time, and I guess that's all.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. With that, I would invite all the speakers to come back onto camera. I'm not going to go through my final slides. I think based on the content that's been presented already, they're not really needed. I would invite all the participants to whatever questions you may have. It could be to the panel. It could be to someone individually on the panel. You can use the Q&A function within the call here to put those forward. So as I'm talking, thinking about those, go ahead and put those in and we can field those. Do want to give a thank you to Laura and Alex and the CEiRSI for the opportunity to all speak with you on behalf of this effort today. We are some of the voices that are on this train, but there are many others. So thank you for that opportunity. Specifically, we'd like to thank Mark and Brandon for you volunteering your time and effort to come in and be a part of this. And then all of you who are here. We are all, to some level, we see a vision here, and whether we are helping to lead or drive that, whether we are writers that are looking to benefit from it, in either case, we're all sort of navigating the same path, and it's great to see this continuing support for this. So with that, I'm going to offer one question first to get this started, and then we can see if others come up. So rewinding back to the theme of this seminar for all four of us, it was contemporary landscape for CM&S in support of regulatory applications, contemporary landscape, right? And so all of us, I think, have identified different things that are contributing right now to the contemporary landscape. Many of those had a pretty extensive runway. And I think we would all agree that the landscape now is quite a bit different than in the past decade or two. That being said, the landscape is continuing to evolve. It will continue to evolve through efforts like the CEiRSI, like some of the other things we talked about. I'm interested from each of you, what do you think is the singular next step that continues to evolve the landscape where you think it should go? Any taker?
Jeff, I'll say global harmonization would really help. Yeah. Getting that acceptance so that we have a more confidence in including In-Silico as part of regulatory strategy globally. This would really help to, I think, stimulate that acceptance, because we are able to build that in knowing that we won't necessarily require as much of the so-called traditional evidence as we did in the past. Big step, but something I think we're all interested in working on actively right now.
Thanks, Mark. Global harmonization, easily done. Brandon, Mark P, any thoughts?
So for me, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have, I think, as practitioners is modeling and simulation, or these in silico technologies applied at the scale of a clinical study. So because of the variability in biology and just the legacy of how studies are performed in medicine, we're being asked to generate evidence like 500, 1,000, 1,500, 5,000 subjects. And that's not the scale that we usually run some of these computationally intensive models at. And until we get to the scale that we can convince our clinical partners that our models actually are representative of population or are representative of what's happening in the clinical scale, I think we may continue to struggle with credibility.
Thanks, Mark. So confidence in clinical representation. Brandon, how about you?
Well, I definitely have a lot of interest in clinical trials, but beyond that, I'd like to see some tools that are added to the space that take someone who has an interest in verification and validation, or at the very least knows they need to do it, and enables them to easily adopt our practices without having to become an expert in VVUQ.
Thanks, Brandon. From my side, for me, what I see is just more real case studies, right, with very specific regulatory objectives, and whether those case studies and turn out to be positive or negative, right? Really getting those case studies out. There's been a lot of work on process, on practical guidance and things like this, but really having examples that we can grasp onto and see. I think that would really help the landscape. Okay.
Jeff,
a question
Jeff,
from the yeah.
Jeff,
Yep.
real quick. Maybe case studies that have also been through a rigorous VVUQ and wind up as part of a mirrored standard that complements an in vitro test standard. So having modeling and simulation test standards that are either developed after the in vitro test or bench test has been developed, or I know something you're an advocate for is developing them at the same time, right? This could also help us. It's boiling the ocean. It's one by one. But addressing some of those traditional bench tests, and even maybe more importantly, I don't know, the non-traditional bench tests, and developing in-silico models for those could be really helpful to industry. So it's kind of a top-down and a bottom-up is the way I think about it. Yeah.
Good point. Thanks, Mark. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it's another way to say what you have said, but what I feel is that from conversations with many of you from industry, you seem to also express that the first challenges you have is also to overcome the internal regulatory affairs sort of units or departments within the companies themselves. And I wonder whether we need to be careful that those examples are not just oriented towards other like-minded people like yourself. So you as an engineer trying to convince another engineer, because we can do case studies probably ad infinitum, but I think there is already a framework. And each of those case studies are quite expensive, effectively, to run, in the sense that require quite some time, especially if you want to scale, as Mark was saying before, numbers to similar to trials, which I think is indeed something to be done. I mean, I tend to think that we need to be working on 2 orders of magnitude larger than the equivalent trial in the real world to be meaningful, right? So if your trial now is 100 people, then you need to be talking about 10,000. If it's 1,000 people, you need to be talking about 100,000, and then I think people will start looking at those. But there's a lot of practicalities about streamlining them. But if we go back to case studies, I would love to have to invite all of you to convene your regulatory affairs from your companies and try to have a workshop with them to ask them what they would like to see. What is the thing that would convince them, as much as regulators, that we will have the opportunity? Because ultimately, those are probably part of the enabler. I think the point what Mark was making, that there is already almost too much literature, I think it's right. And he also added the points that there is some ethical aspect where we should be doing that, but we need to give that a step. So we need to understand, rather than doing more, we need to understand who are the people who are sort of, in a sense, could enable this, or where the hindrances are at the moment, and try to understand what are their enablers for moving ahead. That would be which is not to say that they're not case studies, but it's a bit more slanted in terms of exactly what we are trying to prove.
Yep, good point. Thanks, Alex. Okay, a question that came in, and I think Mark Palmer, you might be the best one based on your vantage point to answer this one. Could you possibly provide some examples of where In-Silico may offer value that isn't an implantable device example?
I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
go ahead, Mark. Yep.
Oh, I was going to say MRI safety, but in the end, you have an implanted device, so it's a tough one. It's a blend, right? Because we're modeling the MRI coil itself, but then understanding the interaction between that MRI coil and the, I hate to say it, implanted device. I'm sorry. I thought the MRI safety is a good one. It's
Still
a blend
comes
of
back
the
around
two.
to implantable devices. Yeah.
Right. It does. It does. My bad. Apologies.
So some of the applications include things like ablation therapies for atrial fibrillation, for example, where a lot of the modeling activity is around how energy is delivered to the tissue, what are the remaining circuits that are left, and then you kind of leave with zero residual presence. There's no like device left behind. So that would be like the delivery of care example. Another axis would be in pharmaceuticals, where a lot of the emphasis, especially during the clinical trial phase, is on arriving at what are safe doses. So quantitative systems pharmacology that are looking at toxicology, toxic effects at different organs. It's a different style of modeling, but it gets into the 3D space when you look at things like cardiotoxicity, where that's a multi-physics effect on the function of the heart. So those are some examples of different modeling domains that are non-medical device.
Thanks, Mark. Alex?
Yeah, it's a bit along the lines of what Mark was saying, but one of the areas, I think if we think about not only products, but also procedures more generally, for instance, radiotherapy, right? Things that you need to customize and make a plan for every individual. And so essentially there is no one device. There's a process, but there is no one single solution for everybody, right? And what you effectively are trying to do is prove that that process, the radiotherapy planning, it could be bespoke devices. Okay, that's implantable again. It's a bespoke type of device. What you're trying to demonstrate is that you could optimize to the best possible device for everybody. What is the top quality that you could achieve of outcome, for instance? So that gives you like a sort of an upper bound of quality and delivery, right? So that would be another example. And then I would also say diagnostic devices like imaging, for instance. So there is a lot of people working as well in how you use modeling of the physics of image formation to, rather than sort of doing biomarker discovery, to do biomarker engineering, where you actually try to optimize for instance, the MR sequence designs, or the dose of a CT scanner, or the excitation of a ultrasound machine to optimize, for instance, detectability or recognition of a particular pattern, for instance.
All right, I was typing in one more answer, but then the answer was answered live. So in an effort to save face, I thought of another example, and that was around inhalers and other OINDP devices. So in those cases, especially generic drug manufacturers have to show bioequivalence. So, is the therapy being delivered to the same place, and is the drug the same? So in terms of demonstrating drugs the same, we can do that, through analytical means. The delivery of the therapy, for example, a nasal spray to the correct location in the nose, and then the ensuing, pharmacokinetic modeling that you might do along the lines of what Mark was talking about, that can be demonstrated computationally. Another one that comes up is auto-injectors. In that case, especially for rescue injectors like EpiPens, we find regulators are increasing the requirements to demonstrate that these devices are reliable to like 1 in a million. It's almost impossible to test to. So modeling and simulation can help with that as well.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I think with that, we have used the full 2 hours. It is either time for lunch or a beer, depending on where you are. Thanks again, Mark, Brandon, for participating in this. Alex, Laura, back to you to close out.
Super. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate your help and your guidance today. That was really fantastic. And so it's just to say thanks to everyone for attending and let you know that we will record the webinar. Well, the webinar is recorded and we will make it available through the YouTube channel from the UK CEiRSI. And I will pass now to Lara, who will let you know which is the next webinar that is coming up. So there will be a sequence of various webinars over the next month and a half. And she'll let you know which one is.
Yep, thanks very much. Let me just share this slide. So the next webinar we have in the series is on case studies of CMS for regulatory applications. So we've got a fantastic panel for this webinar, and they'll be covering real world applications of modeling and simulation from both the medical device and the pharmaceutical world. That'll be on Tuesday, the 4th of March, same time, so 3:30 to 5:30 GMT. So hope to see you all at that webinar, and it's the same process, sign up via Eventbrite. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.